Good morning. Memory is a funny thing. As I looked at this text in Mark chapter 9 and I titled it Room to Grow, I remembered when I was a kid that when my mother would buy my brother and myself new shoes, and I'm not sure how my brother remembers what I'm about to tell you or not, but she would take us down to the Buster Brown shoe store in downtown Carbondale, and we'd sit there and salesman would wait on you and measure your foot and fit your shoes and all that. And my mom would always, when I tried on a pair of new shoes, she would always press her thumb to the front of the shoe to see where my big toe came. And that was because she wanted me to have a little room to grow in those new shoes. Same thing when I didn't care about Buster Brown shoes anymore, and I wanted Converse. And yes, they were white, high-top Converse shoes. When I wanted those, she'd do the same thing. Press her fingers to the front. She wanted to feel where my big toe came. She wanted me to have a little room to grow in those shoes. That was my mother. Of course, mothers aren't like that, are they? Little room to grow. Everybody needs a little room to grow. Whether it's in your shoes or whether it's in your spiritual life, you need a little room to grow. I kind of have an idea that as we get older, that we're not quite so forgiving of ourselves when it comes to a little room to grow, because as we age and as we approach our sunset years, or as we envelop ourselves completely in those sunset years, it's very easy for us to look at ourselves and not allow ourselves room to grow. We're not as forgiving there of ourselves. Now, we expect our preachers to preach that you can't earn your salvation. We would expect no less. And yet, when we look at ourselves, we sit down and think a little bit, and look at our own lives, we're not quite so forgiving. Because we'll take that principle of earning salvation and we'll apply it to ourselves. And we will sit there and ponder and think, here I am, I'm 80-something years old. And I'm not sure that I'll be saved when I die. You look back over the years, you think about all the mistakes you've made, all the errors, all the shortcomings. And you approach later life and you do not allow yourself room to grow. Why is that? I don't know. Is it only true of older folks? No. True of younger folks too. Younger folks in school, fresh out of school, whatever, think they know it all. And they'll straighten you out in a heartbeat. But they don't allow themselves room to grow. Room to make mistakes. And room to learn from those mistakes. Because they know everything. Mark chapter 9 verses 14, and I'm going to shorten my approach a little bit this morning to verse 29, 14 through 29. It is a passage that focuses not so much on Jesus, not on his healing power as the Son of God so much, as it focuses on the mistakes, the errors of the disciples and other people too. People who needed room to grow quite seriously. And that included the disciples of Jesus. They needed room to grow. Others did too. And sometimes we're not quite so allowing of the same thing in ourselves. I want us to look here at Mark 9, and I'm going to begin in verse 14. And we're going to break this passage up into its obviously component parts. And it just happens to be that there are three of them. I didn't design it that way. I guess the Holy Spirit did. But there are three. Main sections here. And for each one of them, there's one word that kind of addresses the situation. Now, as far as the reading that you heard this morning, I asked for verses 2 through 10. It's not part of our text. It precedes our text because it's Mark's account of the transfiguration of Jesus with Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. And what we're looking at this morning, or will look at, is what happens after that. They have come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus, along with the three disciples, they come to a place to find the 9 disciples that were not with them on the Mount of Transfiguration, but they rejoin the company of the 9. And our text begins at verse 14 to help us see what Jesus encountered with his disciples who needed some room to grow, as do we all. So, with your Bible in hand, let's open it. Mark 9. In verses 14 through 18, here's what we have. When he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing, arguing with them. Immediately when they saw him, Jesus, all the people were greatly amazed and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" The disciples. Then one of the multitude answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever he seizes him, he throws him down, he foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast him out, but they could not." All right, we're going to stop there for the moment, because the focus now is on the disciples and what they couldn't do. The disciples of Jesus, these 9 disciples, needed room to grow in the area of performance, casting out demons, healing people, just as Jesus did and just as all the disciples did. But for whatever reason, these guys failed on this occasion. And that's the focus of our attention here. They needed room to grow in the area of performance. In 14 through 19, it's very interesting because when he came to the disciples, that is, when he came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, he descended the high place of Transfiguration, where great things happened, where his whole countenance changed, where he visited with Moses and Elijah, and they discussed his own decease, taking into account the parallel versions of it. They come down from the great Mount of Transfiguration to the trenches of life, where people are gathered. His disciples, along with scribes, opponents, and regular folks. And the scribes are arguing and disputing with his disciples. So there's tension. There's conflict. That's what the trenches of life involve, human problems. Jesus comes down to face that. Probably all of you are like me. You enjoy lectureships, Bible lectureships. I love a lectureship. Because at the lectureships that I attend, thousands of people are there. And at these lectureships, Polishing the Pulpit, Freed-Hardeman University, there's the greatest singing this side of heaven. I mean, it is marvelous. You just sit there in awe and wish it could be that way all the time. You attend some of the best classes that you'll ever hear. You the most inspiring messages. You sit at the feet of keynote speakers that are the best, the most talented speakers in the brotherhood. And you just love it. And then you go home to the trenches of life, where it's not all, sitting with people of like mind and like spirit. You get into the trenches of life where it's hard, where there's conflicts, where people are arguing and disputing, and there's trouble, and that's the trenches of life. And there you are, where you have to encounter that kind of thing, and where very often you will make mistakes. You'll mess up. You'll try to do the right thing, and you don't do the right thing. That's what the trenches bring out of you, you see. So here's Jesus, and presumably Peter, James, and John, they've come and they've walked back into the trenches of life, and the scribes are arguing with the other 9 disciples. Why? Because these disciples could not heal this young boy who was possessed of a demon. Because the dad said, I brought him to you. In other words, I brought him to you via your disciples, and they couldn't cast the demon out. That's the failure of performance. Now, why were they not able to cast out the demons? I don't know. They were able to on other occasions. All you have to do is, in your Testament here, just go back a few pages to Mark chapter 6. And in Mark 6 and verse 7, when Jesus called the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2, and he gave them power over unclean spirits. Well, they had the power. And then you look down at verse 13. 12 and 13. So they went out and they preached that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed many with oil who were sick and healed them. So the disciples had a successful preaching and healing campaign. Everything was clicking along just right until now. For whatever reason, in Mark chapter 9, they could not cast the demon out. So there's a failure of performance. You ever fail in performance in terms of spiritual things? All the time. They needed to grow in the area of performance. Next, we pick up at verse 19, and here's the larger section down to verse 27. He answered him, that is the father, the dad, and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. You know, my dad had a saying. He said, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. I don't know that Jesus thought that or not. But for some reason, again, memory's a funny thing. Here it is coming back to me now. And then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the Spirit convulsed him, threw him on the ground, wallowed, foaming at the mouth. And he said to his father, how long has this been happening to him? He said, from childhood. And often he throws him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. And if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. See, the father takes this personally. All dads would do that. Any dad would do that. That's worth his salt. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, now faith comes into the picture. All things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the father of the child cried out, said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, you deaf, dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him, and enter him no more. And when the spirit cried out and convulsed him greatly, came out of him. He became as one dead, so that many said he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. All right, let's stop there. The disciples, well, let's leave the disciples for the moment and let's look at the dad. The dad, just like any of us, needed to grow in faith. Needed some room to grow, had room to grow in faith. Faith comes into the picture, and Jesus says, if you believe, anything can happen. He says, I believe, but help my unbelief. So the dad admits to Jesus that my belief is there, but it's not exactly solid. I've struggled over this passage for many years. Tried to preach on it once or twice. I don't know that I came close to understanding what it means, but I think I can relate to it. Because I've had to admit countless times in life, my faith is not exactly solid. Needs a little help. I think that's what the dad's saying. I need a little help here. I've got room to grow in this. There's a little wiggle room. All right, I can understand that. Even John the Baptist was that way, of all people. John. In Luke 7, 18 to 23, John the Baptist sent a couple of his disciples to the disciples of Jesus to ask him a question. Are you the one that should come, or do we look for somebody else? And Jesus said, you go back to John and you tell him what you've seen here today. Jesus performing these works, healing these people, doing all of this. Go back and tell him what you saw and what you heard. And I guess that's what they did. But, sometimes you need some room to grow in your faith, because faith is a little bit shaky. Sometimes not really solid. Got some wiggle room there, And you're trying, but there's a little room to grow there. Have to admit that to yourself. Got room to grow, I don't care if you're 85 years old. Got some room to grow there. So they needed some room to grow in faith, okay? Now, the last thought. And here's the key to it. There was room to grow in prayer. Prayer. Look at verses 28 and 29. And when he had come to the house, his disciples asked him, privately. Why could we not cast him out? That is, the demon. Why could we not do that? And he said, this kind cannot come out but by prayer and fasting. Now that's what my mother's Bible says, and that's what my New King James Version says. Some translations do not use the word fasting there. That's because it's lacking in certain manuscripts and it's present in other manuscripts. So, the point is, Jesus said, this cannot happen except by prayer. So they had some room to grow in prayer. Who doesn't? So what was wrong with these disciples? Well, they were too busy arguing with the scribes to pray. They should have left these scribes alone, not gotten involved in conflict and debate, and prayed for this fellow. Jesus said this kind of thing cannot happen without it. But aren't these disciples kind of like a lot of us? We get wrapped up in the tensions of life. We're out there arguing and debating the meaning of this passage and this detail and that detail, and we don't pray. We can't see the forest for the trees. We get involved in all kinds of stuff. And we're too busy here and there. So what happens? We neglect prayer. And that's the point here. So this whole passage is about human failure, weakness. People who have room to grow. The disciples had room to grow in performance. The Father had room to grow in terms of His faith. And we come back to the disciples, and to their credit, they want to know what happened that we couldn't cast this demon out. And Jesus said, you're not praying, that's why. We got room to grow in all of those areas. So, we're creatures of mistake. We make mistakes. We think when we get along later in life, the Lord expects perfection. He doesn't expect perfection. He gives you room to grow. So when we mess up, and when we don't do this right or that right, we're not performing like we should, we don't have faith like we should, we don't pray like we should. We're like these disciples, you see. When those things happen, what can we do? Well, be positive about it. Don't get down on yourself. Don't wallow in your tears and fold your hands and say, oh, sad, oh, woe is me. The Lord won't let me into heaven. Don't do that. Don't do that. But be positive about it. Learn from your mistakes. That's what these disciples did. You can be positive about it. Be determined. Because when you mess up like these disciples did, you know there's always people standing around that are going to notice it. Just like the scribes, they notice it. And they're going to call it to your attention. And they're going to make a big deal out of it. And you're going to feel like you're nothing. All right, that's what the scribes did, and that's what people do. And then that kind of thing affects the faith of other people, like the dad here. The dad was affected by these disciples couldn't do it. I brought them to you and they couldn't do anything. So he's distraught. Well, we affect other people too. So be positive about it. Be determined. Don't despair. Don't get down on yourself, and don't quit the Lord of all things. And then be spiritual. We make mistakes. Yes, be spiritual. Pray. You're not going to be perfect in anything. But pray. That's the spiritual side of this whole thing. And Jesus said that's where you messed up. Faith, yes. Prayer, yes. So we're just like these disciples, We get down into the trenches of life. And we get to butting heads with people. We get busy. We get to arguing. And we forget the most important things in life are to have faith, pray, give yourself room to grow. And don't think, that the Lord's not going to save me because I'm not good enough. Brethren are the worst. If a preacher preached that, you'd fire him for false teaching, and yet we do that to ourselves. Why do we do that? I don't know. Yeah, we have to strive to be faithful, but that's the key to it. Faith, and pray, and learn from our mistake. This section here is fascinating to me because these disciples had room to grow. I do too. So I can't give up, can I? You can't either. Grow in faith, grow in love, grow in prayer, and help people along the way, and help yourself too, as we strive daily in the trenches of life where it's hard and rough, and yet we keep on, don't we? All right. You believe the Lord, you believe the gospel, give yourself to it, obey it while we stand and sing to encourage you.